Humanoid robots are positioning themselves to become one of the biggest industries in human history, and it's happening right under our noses and much quicker than you might think. For example, in the last 12 months, investors have poured $5 billion into humanoid robot startups. Now that might sound like a kind of everyday number in this day and age, but that's more new capital than the entire first decade of self-driving cars combined. Not just that, but by 2030, that number is expected to 20x. That's insane. That doesn't happen every day, right? And so that's just kind of 4 or 5 years away, depending how you look at it. And so in this video, I want to explain the kind of macro idea here, the broader picture, and also give you a particular thing that I'm looking at in the next month or two in terms of positioning that could be a pretty good opportunity. Now, I am just a everyday person like you. I've been trading for about 8 years, but this type of investing is still relatively new. I'm only about a year or so in, so I'm learning and hopefully can educate you on the little bits that I know as well along the way. So let's first zoom out and look at the macro perspective and keep things really, really simple while doing it. The first thing to note is that robots are already happening. This is not just like a concept that a few people have, and artists have got together and been like, oh, this looks cool. Like, this is actually happening. For example, Agility Robotics and GXO have a multi-year deal. So basically robots have been deployed in Atlanta, and that was last year in 2024. And what this did, although it's small, has proven that companies will pay for humanoids on narrow tasks. So things that are repeatable at this stage and things that obviously is within their capability, right? Now, what this does is it's just kind of like a proof of concept, because it de-risks that category being like, oh, is this something that could work? Is it just like a fantasy from people who've watched too much iRobot or whatever, that sort of thing. And so this is essentially the proof of concept. Next one is, we kind of already touched on this in the beginning, but the capital is piling in. This should be obvious as soon as something has proof of concept, especially something that has amazing upside like this. If you think about, if you were able as a business owner to pay a robot to do something that normally took 10 humans over, I don't know, and they could only work 8 hours a day and you had to pay them benefits and all that sort of stuff, it's very obvious that you'd pick a machine that could work round the clock for probably a fraction of the price and who probably wouldn't complain. Kind of not rocket science. Next one is enablers are improving fast. So the logistics of this is that the engines, the models, and the methods that we are able to teach these robots is massively improving. And this means that the robots can learn quicker, function better, and the feedback loops are increasing, which essentially means they're getting better, faster and faster and faster. Finally, competitors show real speed/cost signals. So for example, Unitree, their list price was $90,000 to $100,000. Their top speed was 3.3. I believe this is meters per second, must be. And why it matters? Well, because this is showing, number one, that people will pay for it, similar to the first point, but also showing that it's kind of within the affordability for a lot of different businesses, especially ones that aren't really, really tiny. And so, as this says here, speed is less important than reliability, but it shows that the hardware is maturing. Now, we are at the very beginning of this, right? There aren't many times where you get huge industries being born. We get them being born all the time, but not huge industries like this. And so let's go through kind of some of the top humanoid companies. These are not the only humanoid companies out there, but these are some of the biggest ones out there. So the first one is Figure AI. I personally think that their robot looks probably the coolest, maybe the second coolest. Then we have Agility Robotics. So these are the ones that we were talking about up here, who have the multi-year deal with GXO and operating in warehouses. And then we have 1X Technologies. You might have seen this on social media quite a lot. I believe they've kind of introduced that kind of tendon technology where it looks a bit more human in the way that it moves and whatnot. And then finally, we have Optimus. So this is Elon Musk or Tesla's humanoid robot campaign. Now, I've circled Optimus. Why? Because for me, this is where I'd put the biggest bet right now. And there's a few reasons for it. So the first and probably the biggest one, in my opinion, is that Tesla makes billions in profit. It's worth about $700 billion, I believe, at the time of recording. So Optimus has near unlimited funding. If you look at some of the other ones like Figure AI, yes, they're getting funded. They're running good, campaigns of funding, and that's all great. But there's a lot of jurisdiction, or maybe that's the wrong word. There's a lot of bureaucracy that comes with when you get funding in that way. You're really, you've got to kind of speak to investors and align with their interests, and there's a lot of back and forth, and it kind of slows the whole process down. And also, you can only raise so much in a short time unless things begin leveling up, whereas Tesla is in the advantage position of already having a huge amount of resources, and so that's a huge advantage. Second one is that factories. So Tesla already owns massive factories to build hardware very, very quickly. Next, the parts. So they make their own motors, sensors, and batteries. So again, in terms of speed and being able to grow quickly, there's no waiting on the supply chain breakdown. Whereas if you're another company where you're relying on this company, and this company to build your product, that's going to be a huge advantage, again, for Tesla Optimus. So AI power, so uses the same AI system and data that trains Tesla's self-driving cars. So in a sense, humanoids are just another form of automation. Now, self-driving cars, a form of automation. And so Tesla is already very experienced in this space. Now, humanoids may seem new, and they are new. They present new challenges, but fundamentally, they are in the same kind of sort of industry. And so a lot of those skills are going to transfer over, which brings me into my last point, which is the teams. So Tesla has thousands of top engineers who can jump probably between cars, AI, and robots seamlessly, right? So a few key details about Optimus that I think are particularly relevant in this case. So there are kind of 4 pillars that I've broken this down into. So the first one is what Optimus can actually do in the near future. So the facts that are kind of quite interesting to watch are going to be the hand dexterity, the hours between the faults, and the task completed without teleoperation. So in other words, without a human needing to actually operate them. In other words, automation. So why it matters? So one reliable factory task done all shift without human babysitting is 100 times more valuable than a parkour video. So we've all seen videos online about these robots doing cool stuff, or maybe you haven't, but there's one that Elon Musk posted this week where one of his robots was doing martial arts. I don't know what that is, but whatever. Was doing martial arts, and whilst that's really, really cool, that's going to be very different to when we see real practical uses at scale of these robots. That's really going to be what gets the narrative going in a positive direction. And so how I'll use it, by the way, when I put how I'll use it, this is all a kind of example of how I'll use it. It doesn't mean that I'm following this militantly. It's just to kind of break it down in an easy to digest format, hopefully. So if Tesla shows a factory task done at near human pace with low failure rates, then I'll take the narrative more seriously. Again, we'll circle back on how to actually tile this stuff together in a moment, but for now, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Pillar 2, so where Optimus gets deployed first, in other words, the adoption path. So the most likely first step, I think, is that the internal Tesla factories will be its first use case, because ultimately they've already got so much work that they can automate within themselves, and they can feedback really quickly, and they can probably improve quickest by just learning how to use it in their own factories and their own processes. And then I think the next logical step from there will be logistics tasks that are already proven by others. And then how I'll use it, I'll discount any home consumer talk and care only about the factory logistics tasks in the next 12 to 24 months. Again, this is going to make more sense in a minute when I talk about the actual opportunity that I have in mind with this. So I want you to pay attention to all of the things that I'm mentioning in terms of what I'm looking out for. So when I say how I'll use it, what I'm really saying is keep this in mind, because this is something that is going to be important when we look at how the narrative plays out for this in the next kind of few months, but the same principles will probably apply for the next kind of 6 months, I would guess. So pillar 3, why could this move faster than people expect? Learning and tools. So vision only training. This is something that is pretty new, but essentially it's instead of a human needing to train the robot through movement and repetition, a robot can learn by seeing it, and therefore it can learn quicker. Because if a robot can learn by just going, okay, cool, this is happening and it's doing this, and I'm going to emulate that rather than need to be kind of physically taught and mirror a human directly, that's going to speed up the rate of improvement drastically. And that's something that Tesla Optimus are really, really doubling down on. And pillar 4, finally, what competitors tell us about feasibility. So as I mentioned earlier, the Agility GXO Live, their partnership is kind of proof of concept. Then we have the unitary price speed. We spoke about that earlier. That hardware can be purchased now at about $100,000, and that Figure/1x fundraising investors expect commercialization pushes. So the big question of this video, which is, we aren't yet ready for mass deployment, so why do I care? So what does this mean? At this point, humanoids are not at the stage where they're ready to be rolled out to every Tom, Dick and Harry and, you know, made this big thing and basically creating an iRobot type scenario. We're still a ways away from that. So why is that a big deal? You know, if stocks are just based off of valuations of companies, earnings, then why would that matter? Because expectations of future earnings can still influence the current stock price. And so as investors, that is something very important to understand, because essentially what we're doing is we are isolating this as a narrative play. And so what am I talking about in terms of practically, what does this mean? How can it actually be of any benefit? So the 6th of November, 2025, Tesla is holding their annual shareholder meeting. Now, why is this important? Well, because look at the picture that Tesla themselves have put as the banner photo for the annual shareholder meeting. That to me looks like a humanoid robot, unless I'm going blind and this is some sort of like weird new futuristic car, but for some reason I highly doubt that that's the case, obviously. So why is this important? Well, because it suggests that at that meeting they're going to make some sort of new announcement about Optimus. Maybe it's going to be the new version 3, we don't know. But this is important because if we do our research before, we can understand how to interpret what they say in that meeting much, much faster and understand the implications going in. And so we can make better decisions if we decided to do something in the actual meeting itself. So I'm going to give you an example from the perspective of so this is just a diagram I drew. Obviously, I know it's not, you know, statistically the best diagram in the world, but hopefully you get the message. So the idea is that if we're here now and the shareholder event at the time of recording this is in about a month, this is really how I look at the markets, right? Because ultimately, even if you have all the data in the world, or even if you have all the information in the world about a company, a stock, or even a kind of bigger asset class or whatever, that information is just information. It's actually neutral until we have an interpretation layer. And this is where humans are. We have this interpretation layer on top of the information. This is important because it means that if the interpretation layer is always on top of the information, then when we're working off of new information coming out, we're not just looking at, oh, new information's come out, is this good or bad? We're taking it in the context of how the herd is going to perceive it and basically trying to, I suppose you put it as like predicting a trend or predicting a narrative. Now, I spoke about this in my other video on the channel, which I will link to in the description below, where I'm talking about informational edges. This is an example of one of those. It's basically the main way that I look at the markets these days. And so I will link to that below if you want to go and check that out. But essentially the idea here is that if they do talk about Optimus with some new specific things, and I'm going to go over exactly what I'm looking for in this meeting in a minute. But if they talk about it in a positive way, they show some really, really cool stuff, then we're essentially betting on the buzz growing for this and people taking it more seriously. Now, don't get me wrong, they could come out with a really shit presentation and then it's kind of rubbish, and that's also fine. Again, our job as investors, at least active investors, is to pay attention to this sort of stuff and really use it to make informed decisions. And then in terms of the rest, the reason I included the rest of this diagram is because we may be, let's just say 2027 before proper deployment or regular revenue, or maybe even further away from that. And the point that I'm trying to illustrate here is that despite it being in the future, beliefs and taking a particular market or company seriously can on its own affect true value. So, as I kind of touched on before, this is an example of a narrative play. So we're not looking at the company earnings in this context, but we'd be betting on the attitudes changing towards the stock. But we can't just assume that they'll change just because of a picture of a shareholder meeting. Like, can you imagine how stupid it would be if we saw this and we were like, oh my God, it's got a picture of a humanoid, I'm going to buy Tesla. That's seriously dumb. So obviously you are not dumb, so don't do that. By the way, nothing here is financial advice, obviously. This is just for educational purposes. Anyway, so what am I going to be listening out for? What are the things that I think are most important? Well, there are three main things that I see. These are not the only things. These are kind of more so categories in a way, or examples of categories. So a live V3 demo. Why V3? V3 is if they unveil the new version of Optimus, because Elon Musk has been talking a lot about Optimus recently and how he thinks it's going to be the biggest part of Tesla by a significant margin. Now that's pretty interesting when you consider that Tesla is one of the largest companies in the stock market already. So that's a pretty big statement to make. So live V3 demos showing one or two factory tasks. Keyword is factory tasks there. Done at close to human speed for a continuous stretch. So not just like 10 seconds and it powers down. Like something that could be practical, that shows that the technology is at a point or very, very close to a point where the applications that we've already had proof of concept for, so factories, warehouses, basically production, we're quite close to that. That would be very positive because then we're like, oh, okay, this isn't just about martial arts demos and doing parkour videos. This is something where we're way closer than we thought. And people individually and at a mass scale are much more likely to believe something when they know and can see the evidence of it. This is just how we function, how any rational person functions. And so being prepared for this ahead of time, knowing what we're looking for, and making the kind of ideas of like, okay, I think this is going to do this. If we see this, maybe it's going to go here. You know, that sort of attitude can be the difference between no informational edge and an informational edge. Because as I described in that video, which again, I'll link below this video, it is not just about knowing information that other people don't know. Most of the time, other people do know the information that you do know, but they are discounting it in some way. And so in this case, it may be not enough people watching the shareholder meeting, or a delay or a lag, or people aren't taking it seriously, or they take a few days to think about what it means. Whereas if you prep beforehand and you look ahead, whilst not every time obviously, but a decent amount of the time, you can often be correct at forecasting and understanding how to adapt and react. Anyway, second thing is internal deployment commitment with a number. So for example, 100 units across 3 factories in 2026. That's something tangible, it's something concrete, and investors in particular love holding on to numbers and something that's concrete that they can, cling on to and be like, yeah, this shows that it's working or whatever. And then number 3, any deposit / early access program. So the reason I put this down is because Elon, in some of his previous releases for other products he's done over the years, he sometimes uses deposits to validate the demand for his idea. Okay, now that might not be something he does, but these are basically just 3 ways of saying we want proof. We want more proof other than just martial arts videos, things that show evidence that we are closer to that point of these things being commercially available at a bigger scale. Bringing that closer. The closer we get, the more people are going to pay attention to it, the more it's going to shift the narrative, which means the more potential it has to move the stock. Okay, so why these? Again, they changed the timeline belief from someday robots to paid work starting in factories, which are 2 very, very different headlines. Now, this pushes investors to revalue the story before the revenue arrives. Now, I just always want to push this idea, right? Revaluing the story. They're not talking about earnings being tomorrow and it affecting the earnings next quarter, or maybe even 2 or 3 or 4 quarters. It's all about the perception. Okay, now on a longer time horizon, actual earnings matter more and more and more, but especially these days where we are in a very technologically advanced world where we're seeing exponential growth being more and more common, future earnings are being more and more brought back into the present. Now, they always have to an extent, but now because of the exponential nature, you'll find a lot of times like price to earnings ratios on stock charts are just kind of flying way out of proportion and stocks keep going. And so it's just something to keep in mind. Anyway, as I've said, so I've kind of already touched on this, but remember, if we know that most investors are looking at the same information, then our edge isn't from the information itself, but from doing our homework up front to know quickly if the information confirms our hypothesis or against it. Guys, all this is making estimations, and from those estimations, we are basically looking for evidence like scientists. Loads of hypotheses that we make will be wrong. Fine, but it's about being consistent, and eventually, hopefully, we will find one. So the big takeaway from this isn't about like, oh my God, robots are really cool and like they're going to make money in the future. I think we can all see that they are probably going to be a huge industry. We kind of know that the money's going there, all the things we've spoken about. But right now you can have the best idea that humanoids are going to be great over the next 15 years. But because your timing is off, you can lose money dramatically throughout that whole 15 years. Timing is the key thing, and it's why I'm so strict on evidence-based approach. Like, look for actual evidence rather than relying on, okay, this is like a cool vibe, like I kind of like this. And that's really the core idea. Anything that isn't like a really big step forward, I'm just not interested in. Like, if they have a shit demo or whatever, because this is something that is future earnings, the evidence in this case is evidence that's going to push a narrative. Why would, a shit demo and like, a kind of crappy video, why would that be something that makes investors go, oh wow, this is the thing that's going to shift and change the narrative? It's not. In order to shift the narrative, you need something big, you need something tangible, you need something proven. Think about what investors like. They like money, they like to see results, they like to have belief. Would you believe in something if you just saw something really crap just because you believed in it in 10 years? No, you'd probably just wait until it was really, really good, right? And so this is why it's important to me. Now, in terms of the way I would be looking at this, and again, this is not financial advice, is I'll be watching the meeting and I want to go into that meeting so that when I'm being shown all the things and they're going through it, if they even go over it in enough detail anyway, and when they go over new things, I want to be in the back of my mind going, is this a big deal? Have they spoken about this before? Is this new? How new is it? How are people going to react? And whilst you can't come up with perfect answers to all of those things, just edging it slightly in our favor is really the only goal. The goal for me is just to spot an asymmetric risk-reward opportunity, right? That allows for me to be wrong sometimes, but when I'm right, I make more than when I'm wrong. It's kind of the premise. And I just want to make sure that I'm got the best chance of that happening as possible. Now, this is a different format video. I'm experimenting with new styles for the channel, so I wonder if you like that, please do let me know. If you hated it, also let me know, because I appreciate it. And if you got this far, I very much appreciate you. If you've got any other ideas of what you would like me to make or talk about, also let me know. So there's a lot of let me knows there. I'm going to stop making this video now. Take care, and I'll see you soon.